Welcome to this week's Sunday lecture about the Romans in Britain. I'll talk about why they came here, a bit about what happened, and about the evidence they left behind. First, a confession. Ironically enough, I'm hopeless at pronouncing Roman words and will be avoiding them as much as possible. When the Romans first visited Britain in 55 and 54 BC, they didn't necessarily plan on making it part of the empire. At that time, Julius Caesar was trying to stamp out rebellion in Gaul, Roman France. He thought the British were harbouring refugees and sending support across the Channel, so the initial reason for coming to Britain was to stop the locals meddling in Roman affairs. Caesar's first visit in 55 BC was basically a recce and a chance to establish a foothold in Kent. When he came back the following year, he made it as far as the Thames. Having defeated the tribes who resisted and making agreements with the more pro-Roman tribes in southern England, second reason for coming to Britain, fundraising. British tribes had to pay tribute to the empire, basically paying the Romans to go away and leave them in peace. Our first written description of the Britons comes from Julius Caesar's account of the Gallic Wars, although for a more light-hearted and alternative perspective on the Romans' troubles in Gaul, you might find the Asterix comics an easier read. Caesar says that the most civilized of all the nations were the people of Kent, who he compared to the Gauls. Given Kent's proximity and frequent trade with the continent, that's not surprising. He records that all the Britons dyed themselves with woad, which made them blue, and have long hair and moustaches and shave everywhere else. All this would demonstrate to his readers how un-Roman the British were. Having established their dominance and income stream, the Romans departed and didn't return for nearly 100 years. In 43 AD, Britain was invaded by Emperor Claudius, chosen by the Romans as the least worst option after the assassination of his predecessor Caligula. Claudius wasn't seen as a natural or charismatic leader, so his reason for coming to Britain was to enhance his reputation. In the early years of Roman occupation, activity was focused on infrastructure like roads and on developing the existing British tribal centres of Colchester and St Albans. New Roman-style structures, civic buildings and administration would demonstrate the authority of the empire and also encourage the population to buy into the more civilised Roman way of life. Unfortunately, it also made Colchester and St Albans prime targets during the uprising of Boudicca, Queen of the Iceni, in 60 or 61 AD. The Iceni tribe were recognised as independent allies of Rome, but when their leader died, the Roman authorities tried to take control and seize their lands. When his widow Boudicca objected, she was flogged and her daughters abused. Given that Roman culture venerated upper-class women, this mistreatment really underlined the total lack of respect for native Britons and stoked anti-Roman feeling. Boudicca and her supporters nearly won. They left Colchester, London and St Albans in ruins. They defeated the 9th Legion of the Roman army, and they killed over 80,000 citizens of Roman Britain. Evidence of the town's former glories and of their destruction have been found by archaeologists under and around the modern cities. This was an important moment in the development of Roman Britain. With these major towns destroyed, the Romans could concentrate on developing settlements in locations of their choosing. Anyone attempting to rebel would think twice, having seen how brutally the Romans. But there must have been good reasons for the Romans to stay in Britain for almost 400 years, despite us being such a drain on their resources. At one stage, they had around 40,000 troops stationed in Britain, far more than in many other provinces. The answer, at least in part, was the raw materials that Britain could provide. There were deposits of lead, silver, and lots of iron. There were huge quantities of timber, useful for making things, but also the raw material for charcoal, which in turn fueled metal processing. They valued our hides and wool. Troops stationed in the north particularly appreciated the distinctive woolen hooded cloaks that the Britons made to protect them from our unique climate. Later on, as an agricultural industry developed here, the Romans increasingly relied on grain from Britain to supply troops and settlements in Germany, especially along the Rhine. This demand, and the wealth generated by this trade, led to landowners adopting Roman ways of living and spending their profits on imposing villas and expensive imports. Unfortunately, troubles on the continent led to the withdrawal of Roman troops and administration from some areas. These included Germany, meaning a collapse in demand for British grain, which hastened the end of villa building as wealth declined. It became increasingly difficult to maintain Britain as a province and protect it from attack by other peoples such as the Saxons, and eventually the Romans withdrew from Britain. That was an extreme history, but hopefully gives a bit of background to this next bit where we look at the evidence left behind. Evidence of Roman Britain varies depending on the date, the location, and what survived. Some evidence has undoubtedly been lost to later development or to the elements. Some was poorly excavated by enthusiastic amateurs in previous centuries, and some has yet to be discovered at all. Quite a lot of it isn't necessarily Roman, it's Romano-British. Most of the population, especially outside major towns and military bases, would have been Britons. Their lives were shaped by the Romans to differing extents, with some going full-on Roman, and others seeing very little change to their way of life. I thought I'd start by telling you briefly about what's been found locally. The answer being, not a great deal. Much of the area was covered in ancient forest, and the Romans didn't build major roads nearby. There would have been a coast road running to Dover, and a greater focus on travel and trade using the sea. We do have one claim to Roman fame, one of the most important ironworks in the empire, or as we know it now, Beauport Park. Iron extraction was in full swing when the Romans arrived, but they expanded the operation and made it part of their state-controlled supply system. Evidence for iron smelting and tile manufacture have been found, but not the places where the workers would have lived. We know it must have been quite an important site because a bathhouse has been discovered. This was preserved by the earth shifting and protecting it. The other structures that would have been there may have been destroyed over time or just not discovered yet. The tile manufacture would have been run by the Roman military, and archaeologists have found roof tiles stamped CLBR, which stands for Classis Britannica, the British fleet. This was part of the Romans' military presence along the south coast of England and on tasked with keeping order and protecting merchant ships from pirates. Other than that, only a few Roman coins have been found, presumably dropped by their owners, rather than buried deliberately, as a hoard found outside Eastbourne was. Generally speaking, the south of England tended to be pro-Roman, especially after the Boudiccan revolt, so there was no need to have a large number of troops, forts and fortifications in this area. But moving towards the other end of Roman Britain, the scenario was very different, with Hadrian's Wall marking the furthest extent of the Roman Empire for over 200 years. Built by legionaries and garrisoned by auxiliary troops from around the empire, the wall was designed to keep out hostile tribes from further north. Sounds vaguely familiar. Existing fortifications were linked together by the building of the wall, started in AD 122, and new ones were added evidence for what life in the military was like for the soldiers posted there. Forts with their characteristic playing card shape, barracks and bathhouses, temples and inscriptions, graffiti, military issue kit, and personal possessions. We also have the remains of the civilian towns which developed to trade with, entertain, and house families of soldiers in the forts. At Housesteads Fort, archaeologists found pottery that came over with the soldiers from Frisia in northern Netherlands. In buildings just outside the fort, they found bone dice that soldiers would have played games and gambled with. And in another house, a furnace suspected to have been used for making counterfeit coins. Soldiers from Dacia, modern-day Romania, were stationed at Burdoswald Fort from the 3rd century AD. They inscribed stone altars used for religious rituals, with the unit's name and the names of their commanding officers that they carried out, including 2 huge storehouses for food and repairs to the east gate. And at Vindelander, there's a wealth of surviving evidence thanks to the ground conditions. The wet soil keeps out the oxygen, which makes organic materials decay, meaning that archaeologists there have found items which makes organic materials decay, meaning that archaeologists there have found items of clothing, leather, shoes and other goods, and most famously wooden writing tablets, though experts aren't quite sure why there are so many writing tablets at Vindolanda and not other sites with similar conditions. This chance survival has given us an amazing messages found on fragments of thin, postcard-sized wooden leaf tablets with carbon-based ink. On one tablet, a cavalry officer writes to his superior, asking for exact instructions for his men for the following day, and including a polite request for more beer, please, to be sent to the garrison because they've drunk it all. The documents also provide information about the different roles performed by men at the fort, so in the bathhouse, making shoes, building, doctors, maintaining wagons and kilns, and those put on plastering duty. My favourite tablets are the ones that give more of an insight into everyday life. Probably the best known tablet was written around AD 100 by Claudia Severa, the wife of the commander of a nearby fort, inviting her friend to a birthday party. It's the earliest known examples of writing in Latin by a woman. The majority was obviously written by a scribe, but Claudia has included her own greeting at the end of the tablet. Another of my favourite tablets is a message which anyone who has been on a camping holiday can appreciate. I have sent you pairs of socks from Satua, 2 pairs of sandals, and 2 pairs of underpants. There's then a list of names that haven't survived, finishing with Tetricus, and all your messmates with whom I pray you live in the greatest good fortune. It's only from these tablets that we know that Roman soldiers in Britain wore pants. Before moving away from the military, I wanted to include a unique find from Burnswalk Hill in southwestern Scotland, which shows the determination and ingenuity of the Roman army when attacking its enemies. In the 2nd century AD, the army embarked on a massive attack against a hilltop fort to the north of Hadrian's Wall, which was defended by a local hostile tribe. Slings and lead bullets were deadly in the hands of a skilled Roman soldier, and if that wasn't intimidating enough for the people inside the fort, the Romans soldiers anti by drilling holes in some of the bullets, so they made frightening noises as they sped towards their targets. They were smaller than regular sling bullets, and it's possible that they were thrown 2 or 3 at a time, giving a scattergun effect, which must have been utterly terrifying. Moving on to the non-military now, we also have evidence from towns, religious sites, and country villas. The larger Roman towns offered most of the amenities that a Roman might expect: bathhouses, public toilets and fountains, temples, markets and shops, law courts, government buildings, and perhaps an amphitheatre for entertainment. The amphitheatre at Silchester, for example, had seats for over 4,500 townspeople. If you had pots of money, you might spend some of your time enjoying the fresh air of your country villa, escaping the noise and smell of the town. While some villas were owned and occupied by wealthy families who were living in Britain before the Romans, some villa complexes grew up over time with extensions and renovations, but some of the later ones were grand right from the start. Lullingston Villa in Kent, for example, is thought to have been the country retreat of Pertinax, a governor of Britain and later a Roman emperor. Its surviving mosaics, painted and later a Roman emperor. Its surviving mosaics, painted wall plaster, bathhouse, and underfloor heating system give an idea of the best that Romano-British living could offer, if you were extremely rich, of course. Unlike many other villas, it doesn't have the outbuildings and accommodation you'd expect to find at a villa, and it's relatively easy to get to, which is why I've included it. There are places in Britain where the initial Roman construction has been reused as a whole or in part. Some of our major roads are built along the route of Roman roads, or at least pre-Roman roads that the Romans then paved to make usable. For example, the A2 and parts of the A5 follow the Roman Watling Street, which ran from Dover to Wroxeter. The famous baths at Bath were already a sacred and healing site before the arrival of the Romans. They proceeded to rebrand Aquae Sulis by blending Sulis, the Celtic goddess of water, healing, and fertility, with their own goddess Minerva. The popularity of the warm springs helped to ensure the survival of the site up to the present day. After the Romans departed, their sturdy buildings and high-quality building materials were fair game for scavenging. The medieval Guildhall in London used the wall of the Roman amphitheatre beneath it as part of its foundations. And at St Albans Cathedral you can see where they used brick and tile saved from the ruins of Roman Verulamium to build the Norman church. In some ways the Romans remind me of us. Those who could afford it loved fashion, novelty, and beautiful things. They were cosmopolitan consumers with links around the known world. And they left huge amounts of discarded rubbish, though theirs tended to be pottery rather than plastic.